from the Washington, D.C. area. It's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. And tonight is a very special night. It's something I haven't done before, and that is to have an author on this show talking about her book, The Family Tree. Joining me is Karen Branan. Thank you, Karen, so much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Catherine. It's wonderful to be here.
So what caught my attention is that you were part of a panel for Fall for the Book at George Mason University. And I wasn't able to see you at that panel, but I came and saw you do a book talk for Ollie at the Osher Center. And I am fascinated by this book for a number of reasons. First of all, it is about a lynching, but it is uniquely tied to your family. And you have spent 25 years researching this book. So walk us through a bit about how you came to start researching this 25 years ago and how it ended up being a book.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, I hasten to say that I did not spend every minute of those 25 years writing this book, but most of my energy, regardless of what I was doing, was directed toward what I call the journey of finding out what happened many, many years before I was born in a small town of Hamilton, Georgia. In 1912. At the time I began the search, I did not know about a lynching. I did not know it happened in 1912. I only knew that several things. I had been told several stories by my father when I was about 11 years old. He told me that he had accidentally killed a young black woman when he was a young man. He told me that as his reason why he couldn't stop drinking. My sister and I were desperately trying to get him to stop drinking. And he said he was punishing himself for this terrible crime he had committed and not been punished for. So I put that away somewhere. A 12-year-old doesn't know what to do with a horrible thing like that. So I put it away, literally forgot about it until I was maybe about 50 years old. And in 1984, I did an oral history with my grandmother, Miss Berta. She was called by everyone in Hamilton. I called her Grandmama. She was the sheriff's wife. And I asked her at the end of this oral history, I said, "What was your most unforgettable memory?" And she said, "The hanging." And I said, "What was that about?" And she said, "Well, they hanged a woman and 3 men down near the square when I was a young girl." And I said, "Well, whatever had they done? What was the cause of that?" She said, "Well, they were moonshiners, and they had been in a moonshine war, and they had murdered some people, and they were found guilty, and so they were hanged." Well, at the time, she didn't mention race. She said they had been found guilty, so I assumed it was some kind of weird Southern way of punishing people who had been tried and
Right.
found guilty. 2 years after that oral history I did with my grandmother, my son came to me with his African-American girlfriend, and we were living in Minneapolis. They were seniors in high school, and told me that I was going to be a grandmother. And I was not pleased. They were too young. They were not much of a couple even at the time. But I began to have nightmares about this, and it went much deeper than it should have. There was something almost cellular and primal about my fear, and I found myself screaming and running around the house, and I knew that there was something dreadfully wrong. And I was trying to write some fiction. It came back to me, the story my father had told me about this young woman that he had killed. And so I began to write fiction about that, and it was as if fiction couldn't contain it. It had to be investigated. And one night as I was falling asleep, I sensed very strongly a presence at the end of my bed, the presence of a dead African-American woman. And I felt her, I didn't hear her, but I felt her say to me, go home, find out what happened. And at that point, it was as if I had received an assignment from on high, that this is your job. This is something you've got to do. And I knew that I would spend as much time and go to any lengths to find out what happened at home, whenever. At the time, I thought this was about my father's murder of this young black girl. So I went down, I started asking questions, and everybody I talked to said, no, this didn't happen.
Now, was your father passed away at this time?
My father was dead at this point, and I had never brought it up with him.
Right.
I could have, but I, just
So you're
didn't.
now asking aunts and
So I'm
cousins
asking aunts and cousins and people in the town, black and white, and everybody's saying no. But I asked the aunt that he was actually with at the time. He had reported the story. He said he was with my Aunt Evelyn, who was my mother's sister, not his sister. And so I asked Evelyn, and she said, no, that didn't happen. In fact, she named the woman, said she just died a couple of years earlier. So at that point, I remembered my grandmother's story. And even though I didn't know what that story was about, I said, what was that all about? And she said, that was a bunch of white men fighting over a colored woman. Or girl, I think she said. A bunch of white men fighting over a colored girl. Well, that's a different rendition from what my grandmother had told me. And I knew at that point that was where I was going to go with my investigation. Now, I had been an investigative reporter for 30 years.
Right. So I failed to even mention that when I introduced you. You didn't just write this book out of nowhere.
No.
You are a journalist.
No, I am a journalist, and I thought, well, this is what, I'm not a fiction writer, I'm not a novelist. I need to get out from behind that computer and get down to Harris County on the ground and start finding people and talking to them. So that's what I did.
So this was not an easy feat because this was back in the 1990s.
Right.
Like pre-internet, pre-Google search, everything is online.
Right.
So you really had to do some heavy lifting to talk to people face to face.
Well, I did the best thing. I did what every journalist needs to do. I did that face to face. If I hadn't done that face to face, I would not have had the story. I don't think.
I don't think you would have either, but it's interesting because you get a sense, and you covered this in the book about getting a sense for reading people, because everybody told you slightly different versions of the story. Everybody kind of brought with it something, or the role that their family played, or everybody brought something. So you kind of had to develop a sixth sense about exactly what you were hearing and the veracity, because a lot of people probably did remember it a certain way. But your research at the courthouse, your research through verifiable third-party resources, kind of helped keep you on the course of the story.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, the things, I found right away I found newspaper articles. I found the front page of the Atlanta Constitution for January 23rd, 1912, had banner headlines, 3 or 4 banner headlines, all of which contained my mother's maiden name, Hadley. And it was in that way that I found out that this wasn't a legal execution of white people that was carried out, in a legal fashion, and about some other people. It had never occurred to me. I don't know why, but it had never occurred to me that this had anything to do with my family. So when I saw that name, Hadley, I almost fell off my chair. I mean, it was traumatic. I had never heard this story.
And isn't it interesting, because I was born in Southwest Virginia too. Southern families are very particular about the things they do and do not talk about.
Yes.
We're good at not talking about subjects, right? So the victim that kind of spurred all of this, the event that happened in 1912, was also a cousin, which was the biggest shock of all.
Well, that one, yes, was the biggest shock of all. not only that I had African American relatives, which had never occurred to me. Why? I don't know. I mean, I knew that, back in slavery days, the slave master often raped or took advantage sexually of his female slaves. But, it was interesting, Kathleen, because I would see the names of the 4 people who were lynched. The youngest man was 21 years old. His name was Johnny Moore. Well, I knew that my mother's father's mother was a Moore. I knew that, and yet, I looked at that name probably hundreds of times without saying, gee, he must be kin to us. Perhaps he's kin to us.
Because African Americans often took the names of the people who owned them.
Absolutely.
So why would you think?
Well, I would at least think maybe he was enslaved, or maybe his mother or father were enslaved. I never even made that connection. So that gets into a whole nother thing that I have in my book, which was that an anti-racist all my life suddenly in the process of researching this book discovered that I had a lot of racism in me. It just never occurred to me that I would be kin to a black person. And then when I realized that I was, there were 2 levels of awfulness about it. One was, as a white person who was raised in the South, I was raised to believe that black people and white people should not intermingle sexually. Right. In that way, and that those who did, there was something a little bit about them. So it's very difficult for me to admit that. So I had to admit that I was having problems as much as I was trying not to have problems with my son and his African American girlfriend. But the other thing was that to discover that my great-grandfather, who was the sheriff, and my grandfather, who was his deputy, had knowingly allowed the murder of a kinsman, of a young black man, 21 years old, the same age as my grandfather, was awful beyond belief, beyond words, beyond expression. And so why was that any worse than the fact that they had also allowed and contributed and probably encouraged the murder of 3 other people, one of whom was a woman, the first woman to be lynched in Georgia.
And I think that is kind of key to what a lot of people find remarkable, is about the fact that it was a woman who was lynched along with 3 other men. And when we come back after this break, we're going to delve a little deeper into exactly who these people were in Hamilton, Georgia, and how Karen really discovered her relationship to them. So please join us after the break. Good job. All right.
Some dreams are universal. Dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org. or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century. That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits and give our kids the power of global knowledge. Because kids who understand our world today can succeed in it tomorrow.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. Tonight my guest is Karen Branan, who has written the book, The Family Tree. It's about a lynching that took place in her family's ancestral home in Hamilton, Georgia, which is in Harris County. Thank you so much for being here, Karen. I wanted to just say something about the uniqueness of lynching in this country and the fact that I don't think that there are cultures elsewhere in the world that I'm aware of that where this is part of the history of their societies, and it definitely is in this country. And I think we're seeing a little of that resurface here in the very recent months leading up to the most recent election, is that lynching is specific to black people, to African Americans. In this country, it started certainly post-Reconstruction, even before Reconstruction. In the 1920s, there were lynchings. Even as late as 1946, I believe, in Walton County, Georgia, there was a terrible lynching. So this whole idea of a lynching is very specific to race. Is that what you found as you moved forward in this?
Well, not entirely. There have been numerous or white people have been lynched in this country. Italians were lynched. Lynching was practiced in the West pretty frequently. But I think that it has come because there were so many more African Americans lynched than any other group of people. It has come over time to be associated in the minds of black and white people with race. Actually, there was a lynching in the 1980s in Mobile, Alabama. There was something akin to a lynching in Texas even more recently than that. We are hearing now a lot of lynching threats. There's a lot of lynching memorabilia being put up on the web, and so yes, it has been associated almost primarily with African Americans. And one of the things that I discovered was that misogyny as a cause of lynching. And by misogyny, I mean interracial sex between white men and black women. Because sex between black men and white women was considered to be rape, even though it wasn't always. But there was a movement going on at the time of this lynching in 1912. There was a movement going on throughout the South, primarily by white men and women, but also by some black men like preachers, politicians, academic types, to put an end to misogyny. And each race had their own reason for doing that. And so in a way, this lynching became, because it was about misogyny and it was about all in the family, all in my family sex, it was almost like a show lynching, a billboard that was erected to say, no more, let's cut this out. Now, the way that I discovered that Johnny Moore was a member of my family was one day in the Harris County courthouse. I was looking through leather ledger journals after leather ledgers, going through looking for anything that had any family name on it. And I ran across a certificate of indenture signed by my third great uncle, James B. Moore, indenturing the 7 children of his one slave, Jane. Well, she was no longer a slave because this was in 1868. Jane had apparently indentured herself to him at the end of the war, and at this point, for whatever reason, she was indenturing her 7 children to him, meaning essentially re-enslaving them to their former owner, who actually turned out to be their father, until they were 21 years old.
Well, this was kind of unique because they were no longer property, which up until 1864, they had been property.
Right.
They were his children, and yet they weren't his children legally. So I guess in the kitchen table conversations James and Jane had about what to do about the children, I mean, because he did have them, he had the care of them until they were 21.
Right.
So you can imagine, or we can try to imagine, exactly what their conversations really were about how this was going to work.
Yeah, and he also had a wife. He had no children by this wife. So she was maybe in the kitchen too, somewhere, or at least on the other side of the door, listening in to what was being said. Now, he was not the only person in the South to indenture his slave children. In fact, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the federal government's way of controlling the South at the end of the war, were encouraging white slave owners or former slave owners to indenture their former slaves to ensure income and employment for the slaves. But something was written into the document that I found, which I thought was very telling and which caused me to go further and deeper with my exploration into were these indeed James B. Moore's children. He wrote that he would discipline them in such a manner as a father would. Now, I don't know if that was common. I've read some other indenture certificates, and I have not seen that. So that set me off to, with my interviews, in which I was able to validate maybe with 90% certainty. 2 weeks ago, I discovered that I was 100% correct in assuming that they were my cousins, because an African-American woman came forward and said, I am the great-great-granddaughter of Milford Moore. Milford was Johnny's first cousin, and Milford was a son of James B. Moore. And we tested our DNA together, and we came up a match. So
there's just beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
So
yes.
There was one woman in your family who really was very involved in trying to stop the lynchings. Mm-hmm. I think we have a photo of her. If we want to talk about.
Well, that actually is my grandmother. That's Miss Berta, or Grandmama. She's the one that told me her most unforgettable memory. And in that picture, she's 17 years old. So that was the year that she witnessed the lynching. That was her most unforgettable memory that year. It was also the year that she had just married my grandfather, who became the sheriff of Harris County for 33 years. So that's Miss Berta. She did not get involved in trying to stop lynchings that I know of. She was very much influenced, however, by Miss Lula Mobley, who was a cousin of mine on my father's side. And Miss Lula was she was a maiden lady, as they said. She never married, and she was a very staunch Methodist. And she was kind of the godmother of all the young white women in Hamilton, Georgia for many, many years. And Miss Lula, I think we have a picture of her somewhere. There she is.
There she is.
Miss Lula was a very unusual woman and a very interesting woman. I would not say that she was anti-racist by any sense. In fact, I'm sure she was very racist, as almost every white person living in Harris County, living in the United States back in those days was. But she grew weary with all the killing, and not just the killing of whites by white killings of blacks, but also white killings of white. Because what happened, and what those people told me when I went down to Harris County to interview the elders, as I call them, black and white, they all said to me, every man in the mob died with his boots on. They said some variation of that. And they were correct. I did the hard work, the digging up, and I discovered that 15 men known to be in the mob had been murdered by other men known to be in the mob. Miss Lula grew very weary with this, and she was also a leader in the Women's Missionary Society of the Methodist Church, which regionally, there was a Methodist Church South at that point and a Methodist Church North, because they had bifurcated over slavery. But the Methodist Church South was beginning to speak out against lynching. So that gave Miss Lula the backbone that she needed. And so one day or night, I don't know what time it took place, but she called all the women and the men of Hamilton together in the First Methodist Church, and she said to them, and she had gotten together with the women already, and they had all agreed to this. She said to them, stop the killing. And if you don't, we're all of us women are going to move down to Columbus. Columbus being the large city nearby, 20 miles down the road. After that, the killing didn't stop, but it dropped off precipitously. So, you know, I honor her because I think that had to be a very, very difficult thing for her to do. And it had a spin-off effect on other members of my family who became much more kind of courageous and much less racist in subsequent generations, I think, because of her role model that she provided.
Women were very important in Hamilton. You know, we had a picture of the courthouse. That's the courthouse in Hamilton.
Yes.
And then in the Confederate statue, and there was actually the women raised the money to put together the Confederate the Confederate statue.
Yes. Yes. The women of my family were very instrumental in raising that statue. They also. There was the Ladies Memorial Society, which they ran and were very proud to be a part of. And the purpose of that was to, and this wasn't just at Hamilton or Harris County, this was going on all over the South.
Yes, it was.
To promulgate the Lost Cause. And the Lost Cause was a fiction about the glorious plantation South and the glorious war, and how the South, how bravely the soldiers fought, and how much they all wanted to be there to protect their homeland. And none of this was really true. The South, you know, most of the boys that fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War would drag their kicking and screaming. They had not wanted to be there.
Well, and I want to talk about that when we get back, because they often have said that it was the poor men who fought in the Civil War. The poor men fought the rich man's war. Yeah. And so I do want to talk about that when we get back and how that influenced what happened. So please join us.
Saving for retirement might be easy for some folk, but for others, it might take a little more work. And for those who haven't started, there are still things you can do to catch up.
Oh, that is good news.
Like getting out from underneath past debt. And don't get wrapped up with high-interest credit cards.
Get you some eyes.
Be diversified with your investments. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Your financial goals are not out of reach. The choice is clear. For a happy ending, choose to save.
Everyone with alcohol and drug addiction is in the same boat. With treatment, you can find solid ground. For drug and alcohol information and treatment referral for you or someone you know, call 1-800-662-HELP.
Dude, are you sure you want this tattoo? Because just do it.
some mistakes in life are permanent. Like hearing loss. To learn how to protect your hearing, visit asha.org.
You've probably heard about heart disease, but did you know that it's the #1 killer of women nationwide? Heart disease claims more lives each year than breast cancer, lung cancer, or strokes combined. But there are steps you can take to protect yourself against it. For more information on how you can prevent heart disease, contact your local American Heart Association or visit their website at www.americanheart.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me tonight is author Karen Branan, who has written the book, The Family Tree. And it's about a very unique lynching in Georgia in 1912 that involved the first woman ever lynched in Georgia. But come to find out, over 25 years of researching this book, that some of the people involved, a victim that caused the lynching, one of the people who was lynched, are all related to our author. So thank you, Karen, so much for joining me.
Thank you.
One of the interesting things about the book, and I love the book, I was fascinated with it, but throughout you weaving the personal narrative of your journey, and it is truly a journey of discovery, how you, from the very beginning, your interviews with your relatives, the many trips you made down there, but all the while, you also tell us what is happening in the United States, starting with slavery and how slave owners moved from Virginia down to Georgia, the relationship between those particular slave owners, which were not necessarily all plantation owners, as they tended to be in Virginia. You talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction. You talk about convict labor. Now that was, wow, it blew my mind, because that was not something I knew about, is how many states and certainly many cities were built on the backs of convict labor. So I love the fact that you gave such richly researched context for the situation in Hamilton. It was not a bubble. It was not, the fact that there was a lynching was remarkable, and yet not for the times in which it happened.
Yes, everything that went on in Hamilton went on all over the South. There was nothing that unusual, sadly. I wish Hamilton had been unique, but it isn't. It all begins with slavery, really, because for generations, white men and women acclimated themselves to the idea that black people were property. They owned them. They controlled them. They watched over them and after them. And, there was a group of men who didn't own slaves, often didn't own slaves, who were patrollers. So the idea that every white man had a law enforcement position, regardless of whether he had ever really been hired or appointed anything. So they all grew up as very young men, and many of these patrollers started out at very young teenage years, learning to control black people. And this became a part of really the regional DNA and the national DNA, because the whole country, the early colonies, all had slavery. So they all practiced that. And we're seeing this today, that white people feel that they have a say-so in what happens to black people. And so what?
Well, law enforcement particularly. Eric Holder mentioned that at a panel on community policing, and Eric Holder was saying Americans need to understand the history of law enforcement and race relationships, because people really truly don't. But in your family, you have sheriffs.
Right, I have 6 sheriffs.
6 sheriffs in your family?
6 sheriffs of Harris County, going back to the 1830s.
So that uniquely positions your family, yes, I think, in this story.
Yes, yes. And what I discovered was that very few members of my family had not participated in one way or another in the law enforcement system. It was filled with nepotism.
Right.
You hired the deputy, you hired the bailiff, you hired the jailer, and they were all kin to you. So the idea of controlling black people is very much a part of my family, and was more so then, obviously, than it is now. What happened, Reconstruction scared the hell out of white Southerners for many reasons. When you have held captive millions of people for 400 years,
right?
You don't just set them loose and relax. They were convinced they were going to be.
Yeah, there would be uprisings. They feared for their safety.
What happened, however, was that there were no uprisings. And in fact, what happened was that something I was never told, I never learned, but in Harris County, there were a lot of very successful black men, women, and children. Educationally, they started going to school. If you look at the statistics, it's amazing how the literacy rate just spiked. The land ownership rate spiked. Farm productivity spiked. Nobody went after anybody, but they were successful. The short period of time in the late 1860s and early 1870s that they were actually elected or allowed to be in the state legislature, when they were allowed to rewrite the Georgia Constitution under federal mandate, the program was something like Bernie Sanders supporters might call for. It was very progressive. They called for universal education. They called for women's suffrage. There was nothing I saw in that program that I would not be delighted to see today.
Right. Wouldn't we be delighted to see it today?
Well, this scared the hell out of those patriarchal, wealthy white men, the 1%. And it was actually the 1% in Harris County. And they had to find ways not only of putting down that progress, that success, but they especially had to find ways of, because blacks and poor whites were coming together. Progressively, they were coming together. That could not happen. That had to be stopped, yes. And so many ways were found to stop it. And one of those ways was disenfranchisement, which we see going on today. One of those ways was scaring the wits out of people, getting white people focused on black criminality, which you see happening today, when in fact there was very little. A lot of racist propaganda. Politicians, men like Ben Tillman in South Carolina, men like Hoke Smith in Georgia, men like Vardaman in Mississippi. The South was rife with demagogues.
And it was about creating systems that could be perpetuated and enforced.
Absolutely.
So that they could never break away.
So what they did, they passed laws called black codes, which were laws aimed only at black people. Talking too loud, could send you to prison for several years.
You know where I see that mirrored most often? I've done a show on the school-to-prison pipeline, which also targets African-American young people in schools, and it's the same thing. They're disruptive.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, you send them to the
resource
officers.
A lot of these laws were around that.
So, to me, this is such an echo of history.
Right.
Only if you don't know history, then you're not hearing that echo of something that's existed for centuries.
Right. And we didn't use this phrase back then, Catherine, but we had what's called mass incarceration today. Huge numbers, tens of thousands of African American men and some women being rounded up for no good reason and put into prison, and then their bodies were sold to private corporations, to private individuals, to mines, to all kinds of the kinds of businesses that people did not want to go to work in willingly. They had cheap labor, very cheap labor, for years and years and years. And many men and women died under those circumstances. And that, so you take slavery and you take the convict labor system, and you're talking about over half this country's existence.
Right.
Well over half this country's existence. It's in our DNA. It's in our bones. It's something we've never apologized for. Few people even know about it. So what's happening today with mass incarceration, with police brutality, I show in my book that in Hamilton, right after the 1912 lynching, for which Hamilton got quite a lot of criticism from newspapers around the country, around the world actually, from a lot of politicians, because it wasn't popular. The people loved lynchings, but the politicians were not, some of them were not that crazy. The industrialists really did not like lynchings because it scared Northern investment away. So what you had is a move toward capital punishment. So my grandfather, my great-grandfather, the sheriff, right after the 1912 lynching, went down to Columbus and held a press conference and announced gleefully that 3 black men had been legally sentenced to die for crimes that would not have been considered hanging crimes. But under the circumstances, he was eager to prove that Hamilton was a law-abiding town. And so he announced that 3 men would be hanged the following, within 6 months, and was happy about that. And that's the kind of turn that the South took away. So we can be happy that lynchings ended, but what they gave way to were
execution, and Brian Stevenson has written extensively about that in Just Mercy. Excellent book. But basically, again, what is happening in Alabama or the cases that he writes about are just an echo down the hallways of history. But we don't teach this history in school, which is why I think the research in your book is so very valuable, because a lot of it I didn't know till I read the book, but I can see what's happening today, and I can see the work of other writers, and the fact that we are basically continuing and perpetuating a system that has existed for 400 years. There's just no question about it.
Yes. Yeah.
So one of the things that I want to delve into in the last segment, we'll talk specifically about what happened that morning of the lynching. These people all knew each other. Your great-grandfather knew them all. They were rounded up, they were put in the jail, and your great-grandfather left town. And so let's talk about that and what happened in the aftermath of that. And basically, what do you think are the takeaways that all of us need to have about understanding our own American history?
Yeah.
I think that's becoming incredibly important. When we talk about terrorism in this country and think it's somehow outside our country, for Black Americans, terrorism has been something that has been part of our history from day one. So please join us in our last segment so I can wrap up this wonderfully interesting series of talks with Karen Branan and her book, The Family Tree.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about life. Nothing very nice. Holy smile. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home? When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water. At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site. That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff. You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent! Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Karen Branan, author of the book, The Family Tree, about a lynching in Georgia, which intimately involved members of her family, both the ones that she knew about and ones that she discovered on her journey as she researched what happened on January 22nd, 1912 in Hamilton, Georgia. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing this with us tonight, because I think your journey is fascinating. I love the book. I mean, it would be something I would want everyone to read. And in giving us context to what happened, because you give us a lot of background, both on your family and how you came to even research this, but then you actually come to the morning where the people have been rounded up. These are people that your great-grandfather knew by name. Everybody knew each other. And, you know, and you describe in the book what they must have been thinking, that perhaps he was doing it for their own protection even. And they were put in these cold jail cells, ones that you'd played in as a child, that you were familiar with, the cells where these 4 people were put. So what happened that fateful day, as far as you can piece it together?
Well, there were, time was running out. My great-grandfather had never been able to actually bring any charges against the 4 people. The only evidence that he thought he had was the woman was supposed to be the witness. She changed her mind. Much to her credit, she decided she wasn't going to go the way of so many other black women in the South who had been forced to bear false witness against their brothers. He didn't have a case. He was going to have to let them go. He was a new sheriff. This would have been humiliating. He had a group of mean relatives, moonshine men, who solved their problems with guns for the most part, who were not going to see this happen, who were determined that these people were going to die. Now, the woman they did not really want to kill. They really believed that at the last minute that she would point the finger. So at the tree, they gave Dusky Crutchfield a chance, a second chance. They said, point the finger at who did it and we'll let you go. To that she said, pull the rope, white man, making her an incredible heroine in my eyes and the eyes of anybody who knows what that meant back in those days. My great-grandfather did what the mob told him to do. He took the train to Columbus. He left his 21-year-old son, the only law enforcement official, to oversee that horrible, horrible event. What could have been going on in his mind? I have no idea. He had a large family. He had a nervous wife. He had a wife, I found out, who had witnessed her brother kill their father when she was 10 years old. There was a lot of dysfunction, a lot of trauma in that family, none of which excuses anything. What he did was beyond cowardly, beyond brutal. He probably thought he had no choice, and maybe he didn't. He knew those men, many of whom he was kin to, had killed and would kill again. Perhaps he did it to save his own life. Perhaps they had threatened the lives of his family. I don't know. It was a hard time. It was also a time when it was much easier then, I think, than now, though now I'm beginning to wonder, when white people did treat black people as less than human. Black lives did not matter back then. Even black lives that were your family members did not matter.
So in this journey that you have undertaken, you have discovered family that you didn't know you had. As you said, you've had DNA testing in the last 2 weeks that have confirmed you've got African American family members. What has that been like to meet them? How have they received your efforts? How have they received the book and your willingness to tell this very painful story about your community?
In a word, it's been wonderful. It's been truly wonderful because these people that I have met are truly wonderful people that I'm very sorry I did not grow up
knowing them and being a family with them. This is one of the families here. These are not my actual blood kin. They may be, but we don't know that yet. Deborah and Christopher and Jasmine on the left are descended from Isaac Williams, who was enslaved by my third great uncle, Britt Williams. And I sought them out when I first started working on this book. It was Deborah, who is the family historian, that I met, and she has been an angel on my shoulder and a wind at my back ever since we first met. I also I went to their family reunion back in 2010, and I presented them with some of the information that I had from the family papers on their enslaved ancestors, some things which they did not know, though they actually had done a lot of genealogy. I have only met one relative through the Johnny Moore connection so far, and she was one of the first African American professors hired to teach at Emory University, from which she has recently retired after 30 years teaching there. She and I grew up literally side by side in the same area at the same time, not knowing each other. We have both lived our lives devoted to public education and to African American education and desegregated education. And while we've just recently met, we are, I hope, on our way to becoming fast friends. Some other people that I've met, this is me with Christopher, who is also descended from Isaac Williams and is a dear little grandson of mine at this point, though not really necessarily certified by DNA. He feels like a grandson. I was reading, this is Isaac Williams, who was one of my great uncles, slaves. He clearly is the product of a black-white relationship, so I would not be at all surprised if I weren't blood related to all of his descendants. Some other people I've met are descendants. These people I met in LaGrange, Georgia. I was doing a reading at the library there, and I began to talk about a second lynching. It was not called a lynching, but there was an African-American farmer in 1947 who was beat to death and shot by the police chief
in the Hamilton jail. And my grandfather was the sheriff at that time. And by law, my grandfather was responsible for the safety of prisoners and therefore bore some responsibility for the murder of their kinsman. I did not know they were in the audience. For some reason, I began talking about this lynching for the first time that I'd mentioned it in over 60 talks that I've given. And as I began to talk, I noticed that they were exchanging glances and nudging one another. And I realized what was going on, and I stopped and I said, "Are you Peg Gilbert's family?" And they said yes. And we began a conversation that I'll never forget. And they came for, they shared with there were a lot of people there, and they shared with all of us what that meant to them and how it had affected their lives up until this very day. And I have become close with them, and hopefully we are talking about ways of doing some reparations and doing some work in Harris County and in LaGrange around recognizing what happened to their grandfather and their great-grandfather, and in some cases it was a brother-in-law of the older women, because this didn't happen so long ago.
Right. I mean, I think that's what stuns a lot of people is that, like you said, you know, the horrible incident in 1980, but right. Even back in the 1940s, post-World War II, the lynching in Walton County was two couples, you know, two men and their wives, one of them pregnant. Right? And I mean, and no one's ever been brought to justice. The FBI reopened that case not too long ago, and nothing. Like, no one's ever to blame for these crimes. Yeah, there've been a lot of efforts to get at a lot of these things, and I think, you know, my mission is to say to white people, and especially white Southerners, because that's what I am, do what I've done. Go find out what happened, and if you find things like I've found, talk about it. Fess up, because this is what keeps us apart, are these unnamed crimes. We have these fears. People don't realize it, but they are afraid of one another because we have not brought these things into the open. And, you know, said at the very least, I am so sorry. And this is what I said to them. It was all I could say. I said, I am so sorry that my grandfather did not have the courage to do his job, did not have the courage to step in and say, no, you're not going to do this. And because he did not have the courage, I had to find that courage to say, this happened. I loved my grandfather. I'm not trying to get him for anything. I adored him. And it breaks my heart that he did these things. Well, I appreciate you being on the show. I'm going to show everybody here the book, The Family Tree. It is fantastic. I loved every minute of it. I think this is something that I wish every high school taught in history class, because it would certainly illuminate how we arrived at this place in our history in 2016. I could support that too. So I do recommend everybody, if you haven't gotten the book, get the book, Family Tree. Join us next week for Inside Scoop. And thank you for joining us this evening.